thank you everybody, and thank you everybody online. I don't know who else is online, but thanks. Wow, I think it's a fantastic study, and first and foremost, I think, you know, primarily thanks obviously to Graham and Ian, obviously hearing from Sophie today, my colleague Anne, who helps kind of coordinate these sort of things. So reflections. It's interesting. One of the things I wrote down on my notes, and I've written loads of notes, and I probably won't be able to read my own handwriting, but I think that thing about tension's really interesting. That tension that we find in what has become a contested space. I'm sure a number of us who've been interested in place and identity and social infrastructure recognise that probably more so than ever, that space out there has become a very contested space. I don't necessarily think the current political rhetoric is helpful in that regard, but I'm going to say very little about that, because it's not a conflict that we should be trying to encourage. Actually, the challenge we've got at the moment is that there is no such thing as a war on the motorist. I think what we've seen, actually, through studies like this, is that there's a contest between the space that people require to thrive, the social infrastructure that will support them in doing that, and the space and time and effort that we give over to basically supporting people travelling around in mechanised boxes. And I think it's really interesting to see this sort of report that was ethnographic in nature, led at the local level, based on qualitative research, and, you know, actually talking to real people, real situations about their lived experience. So from my point of view, and I'm sure from Anne's point of view, as sort of working with Graham to commission this report, I think it's a fantastic result, because I think it's done exactly what we asked, which was get under the skin of a topic in a local area on the principle of a lived experience. So I talk about tension as well. I thought that was another thing that came out, and it wasn't because I was feeling tense sitting there thinking what I'm going to say for 10 minutes, but it was actually, I was reminded of a dark, wet, foggy, wintry night once in a committee in the wilds of Cheshire East, and we had a really nicely spoken young chap from the Youth Parliament, and bear with me where I'm going on this, because he was a young person, not an older person. And he presented an issue to do with certain things, antisocial behaviour actually, to a group I was with, senior police officer on one side, senior counsel on the other side. And we were having a really interesting conversation with this lad, and then one of the committee members piped up and said, yes, well, you're a young person. He'd identified that person as a young person. You can tell me this, we spent all of that money on them very lovely teen shelters in the middle of the park, and yet the local youths hang about outside the library at night, intimidating people. At this point, the chap from the Youth Assembly at that point was shrinking slowly in his seat, and he bravely piped up and went, that's me and my friends. At which point the committee were like, what? Well, why don't you go and use the shelters that we provided you in the middle of the dark park in the middle of winter? At which point the teenager said, well, because it's really scary and that's where all the drug dealers go. So we like standing by the library because there's adults and we feel safe. So this kind of contested issue, I think it's about that sweat in the details, and it's really important that we do. And I work for a big strategic organisation. It's difficult for us sometimes to sweat the details, but what I think it does tell me about, so particularly the active travel programme, is that we've got to do more and think more broadly about how do we serve that question of walkability within communities, because I think it is fair to say that there has been a perception that our programme is driven by cycling and we're only interested in providing space for cycles, and that's probably not true, and colleagues involved in it will know we try really hard to accommodate for walking. But it's not necessarily just about the mode. I think what I also heard, and Sophie will correct me if I'm wrong, but transport has a role as social infrastructure in itself. So active travel isn't a mode. Active travel is an enabling activity. The modes are walking, wheeling and cycling, and just like that group of people that we've interviewed, they're not homogeneous in the sense of what you need to do for them. Walking is a much more finely grained, nuanced thing that can be affected by people walking across the landscape and we've got out there, and if that's your barrier to reach the thing on the other side of the road, then you will not make that journey. So sweating the details at a local level is very, very important. I was really encouraged though when I heard words like identity and attachment, because Graham knows that that's one of my kind of passions, which is understanding people's association to place and their attachment to place, their identity to places. And I think the other thing where there has been a war, and I'm afraid that is, I'm going to firmly hand the blame, like all traffic engineers do, to planners and say, well, it's all the land use planners' fault. Okay, because we've got it completely wrong, haven't we? We've kind of dismantled the whole structure of our community. But I have to hold my hand up, I've been involved in that as well as a transportation planner. So I think these sort of studies are really helpful in telling us, how do we reconnect to communities? How do we re-understand, potentially re-engineer communities so that we can actually connect people to that sense of place, that sense of identity, the walkability. And I think we have got a role to play in that, in the investments we make. So it'd probably be remiss of me, I don't know if anybody's noticed, there's something to do with buses going on in Greater Manchester, but principally we are attempting to create a revolution in transport in Greater Manchester, and it is a really, really exciting time to be part of that, and it isn't right, and we aren't going to get it all right initially. I think what we've done with the first stage of franchising is very brave. You know, we're reclaiming and returning to a public asset a system which is there as a public good. It is designed to work for customers. It's not intended solely as a vehicle, for want of a better word, for transportation. So if you hear what Andy and others talk about in the context of the B network, it isn't just about the buses. It is very much about its connectivity to active travel. It's very much about its role in facilitating much of the things we said here. But when we do build stuff, and I'm responsible for a big programme of building stuff, I think it is really important we learn those lessons about that actually when you do what you do, you can make it a good place to spend time. Because transport should also be about dwelling and enabling and interacting. I think one of the things I also heard and came through quite strongly to me was that the process of walking particularly is, I would kind of interpret this as kind of has social capital in its own right, because you are physically engaging with your environment, and therefore actually you have a sense of place because you are present in that place. You're physically interacting with that place, whether you're on foot or by wheel or on a bike, and actually your interactions with others are personal and personable. They have to be. You have to have eye contact, you have to meet, you have to move around people. So I think this sort of study tells us a lot about the kind of places and environment that we have to support the delivery of. I really like some of the recommendations, and there's a lot of thinking going on at the moment, and we have a bit of a placeholder, sort of early news I suppose. We have a placeholder at the B Network Committee in December where we're going to bring back some information about a year on from when Dame Sarah Story refreshed our active travel mission, and a lot of the things I heard here probably will sound quite familiar in some bits of what we're going to be saying. So trying to improve the sense of walkability. I like this idea of the audit of public transport. One of the challenges I have with colleagues in Metrolink and Bus is, well, how are you going to integrate what you're doing in active travel with those modes? Obviously, we're not dealing with it in that way. We're trying to deal with it collegiately. But the point I would make about that is integration isn't just juxtaposition. You know, I've been a transportation planner for 20, 30 odd plus years, and you can put stuff next to it, but that doesn't mean it works. You know, I think the point that Graham said about solving the information gap, solving the way systems support people to interact, ticketing, making it accessible in that way. I think learning the lessons around access. There's a lot wrong in our infrastructure, both the green, the blue and the kind of highways public network, where we have barriers either deliberately placed to apparently control antisocial behaviour. But what behaviour does that then restrict, as we've heard? And that's a consistent theme from inclusivity, from older people, from those with mobility needs. So we have to think really carefully about where do we go next on that question of removing those barriers perhaps and tackling antisocial behaviour in some other way. Because to my mind, and it's something that I've had an interest in a varied career, but it always seemed to me that when I was dealing with things like highways network management, what we were largely dealing with is something in sort of management theory that's failure management. So what you're constantly doing is repairing the failure. You don't ever go back to the thing and go, well, let's fix the thing in the first case. Let's just keep fixing the failure. And that is a systematic habit that, I'll be honest, I think the UK has, rather than actually trying to solve some of the structural problems. So we have to think, as one of the strategic organisations in Greater Manchester, really carefully about, well, how do we help not keep falling into failure management? I'm just not sure how much time I've got left. 1 minute. And then I think, I started at the beginning of this thinking, well, where do we go with these sort of things? And I think it was really interesting, as I say, this idea of Lee in Japan, rather than Lee having been subsumed by Wigan. But I think what I think that was saying is that people see beauty. And actually, one of the things that reading this study earlier in the week filled me with, and just listening to Graham and Ian Stork there, actually people do still see beauty in their local area, and people want that sense of beauty. I'm quite lucky. I live near smallish Victorian Park, but it's still got an avenue of cherry trees in it, and it's absolutely fantastic. And the anticipation of waiting every year for, like, when the cherry comes out and just going for a walk for a couple of days is really important to me and my sense of identity. I'm very lucky. I moved to a town that's a 15-minute neighbourhood. Don't tell anybody because they'll make me stop enjoying walking to a coffee shop or a library, But it does fill me with actually optimism that actually what we heard in there is people don't want to live in places that are miserable. They actually do want to live in places that we collectively, and I'm sure some of you in this room and others online, are actually trying to help achieve. And we won't get it right all the time, but I do think that sense of optimism ran through that, and I do think there is an opportunity for us to change it such that places for everyone. And I picked on that. It's unfortunate that's the name of our planning kind of structural approach. But context, for example, we are about to publish our Streets for All design guide, and that is a place-centred approach. It's driven by the idea of context-sensitive design. So the important thing about that is we've got typologies of streets. And again, we probably won't get them entirely right, but the principle is we'll have a context for that street and the appropriate activity in each of those streets, rather than just every street being treated in kind of the same way. And I think that is also something that comes out very, very strongly. So, yeah, to close, again, just thank the team here as usual. A fantastic series of events that have been going for some time. And yeah, happy to take any questions as part of the overall panel. So thank you very much.